Greg Troutline with Offshore Engineer TV, and we're very pleased to be joined again by Phil Lewis, the Director of Research for Intellitus, to discuss trends in the OSV market. Phil, to start, how do you see the floating production system market changing in this volatile offshore oil pricing environment?
Well, first, Greg, thanks for having me back. Always good to catch up. And you're right, it's a pretty volatile time at the moment. Oil prices are obviously high on supply-demand issues and also some geopolitical issues. For the oil and gas industry, E&P industry, you would say oil prices are a good indicator of activity and something to get excited about. But I think you've also got to be worried about them going too high and too sustained, where they begin to cause economic damage. But at the moment, in that $120 per barrel bracket, that you would see as a good a proxy for sort of creating a foundation for solid demand and activity. And you've got to remember that the industry has had really poor times since 2013. When oil prices went down, E&P budgets were slashed. That meant vessels were not getting utilized, so there was a lot of laid-up vessels, OSV vessels I'm talking about now. Low day rates, low utilization equals low incentives to maintain all the fleet, so there was a portion of the fleet in layup and frankly probably won't return. And the strong owners have survived, but we've got this situation and now where supply on paper looks like there's a lot of OSVs out there, but strictly speaking, a lot of those OSVs in long-term layup, there are real doubts about some of them coming back to the market. So what that means is, if we look at the floating production segment, which is really what we're touching on today, you've got globally an average around about 700 OSVs, plus or minus, providing long-term support for the floating production and offloading systems market. Now, our base forecast is that there are around 425 additional OSVs will come up to support those units that are being ordered now. They're actually, that means units that are being manufactured or are planned. And we do look at the planning by timing in our reports, too detailed to go into now. But so, these 700 OSVs, so what do they support? There are currently 360 floaters. And what do we mean by floaters? We mean FPSOs, floating production, storage, offloading units, so oil, processing and storage, FLNG, floating liquefied natural gas, production and storage units, FPUs, floating production units without storage, like the semis that you get in the Gulf of Mexico, TLPs, spars, production barges, FSOs, floating storage and offloading units that have storage but no offloading for oil and condensate. And then you've got the FSU LNGs, so floating storage units for LNG. They float, they store, they don't produce LNG. Now, of these five categories, floating productions are by far the biggest. And if we look at those five categories, there are around 200 on order and planned systems. And we break up the timing of the planning and looking at that. Now, FPSOs are by far the biggest segment, and that's Brazil and Africa. They're the top markets where you see ordering and planning. That means for the OSV operators, that's where the bulk of the activity will be. FLNGs is a small market. There are only 5 installed today, but it is the fastest growing segment. And there are projects in Africa, in the US, Canada, among others. North America is really a floating production unit, FPU market. So that means semis, TLPs, and spars. Actually, more than half the world's units are in the Gulf of Mexico of that type. And over 40% of the planned units and on order units are for the Gulf of Mexico.
So specifically then, I know we're here talking about floating production, but where do you see the opportunities specifically for OSVs today?
Okay, well, maybe let's start by reminding ourselves what the OSVs do with the floating production systems. That creates demand. Well, first you've got to move the hull. I mean, these are floating structures, and they've got to be moved. Now, if you look at the analysis, a lot of them, a good proportion, are made in Asia, whether that's Singapore, South Korea, or China. There are the yards in the Middle East and some South American yards, but ostensibly you are really looking at Southeast Asia as a origin for moving them. So if we're saying there's a global market, obviously Southeast Asia is one of the markets, but Africa, Gulf of Mexico, Brazil, Europe, you've got to get these floating production units there. So if we're looking at, say, the FPSO market, that biggest segment, generally, our analysis shows that you get 2 to 3, around 200 ton plus minus bollard pull tugs for an FPSO. Now they're the larger kind of tugs. Once you start getting into that size, as sort of 16,000 horsepower and above vessels, you start to get to a bit of a tighter, more specialist supply. Dry tow is always an option, and there are vessels that can dry tow these heavy lift vessels, the largest of units. For instance, Equinor's Johan Castberg, which she featured in the magazine recently, on its voyage from Singapore to Equinor's field in Norway, that was taken by Boskalis' one of their Boskalis heavy lift vessels. So dry tow is an option, but there's only a finite amount of vessels that can actually do that dry tow. So you still rely on wet tow. Self-propulsion is an option, but it's not particularly widely used. When the hull gets there, well, it requires installation and mooring support. Well, the actual moorings can be done by anchor handlers, but certainly a lot of the risers and that hookup work is done by offshore construction vessels, which we're not really looking at. We're looking at that mooring support. So that's holding the FPSO, let's say, in station while you connect it to its moorings and you connect it to its risers and basically get it in a position so it can produce. But to hold it in position until those moorings are there, you need some powerful tugs. Often some of the tugs that brought it there supplemented by equally large tugs. So you'll see 4 or 5 tugs there. Like moving the hull, that we're talking relatively short time. You're talking weeks and months. You're not talking years of vessel demand. So the owners are looking at weeks or months of those type of works. Then you get to the support phase. Now, these units you would hope would be producing as long as the field produces. Obviously, to get the most out of an expensive asset, you want it to be there for quite a long time. They're not always there for a long time, but they're generally there for quite long numbers of years, 5, 10 years. So you've got to support them, and that means you've got to support the off-takes if they've got storage. That is supporting shuttle tankers, moving the mooring lines, hawsers, hoses, creating static tows so they're stable, creating the pilotage tandem mooring for the FLNGs because they moor side by side. You've got to resupply the vessel. You've got to have standby for safety, pollution, fire control. Different markets require different things. And so you see quite a lot of regional variations there. I would say you see anchor handlers and terminal tugs, and quite a range of sizes depending on the geographic location, and that's some of the analysis we do. That's very much brought out by the analysis we do. Mid to large size PSVs, so you're talking the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 deadweight PSVs, so the larger segment of PSVs. And then you get the more specialized fire or pollution control or safety, depending on the region. People will have their different types of vessels for that. And so there are a wide range of sizes, and it really does depend on the characteristics of the region and also the type of operations that are there.
This crowd, everybody likes to pin a number. When you look at the opportunity, how big is this opportunity for OSVs?
Well, we produce a base case, and there's a range around that. But that base case number, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of 425 units. Now, because it's a granular level forecast, so I won't go into it there, but we share some of the information with you, which is in the articles I believe you're going to be publishing. But Yeah, we're looking at about 425 more units, up from the 700 units now. That's for the long-term supports. That's long-term demand, and that's spread over different time periods. It's not 425 units tomorrow. It's 425 units spread over the FID timing of the units, and that's on a base of 700 long-term units today. So 425 more OSVs compared to roughly 700 today units of OSVs. That's quite a significant market growth.
When you look at some of the challenges ahead, what do you see?
I sort of alluded to it earlier. There's actually a general tightness in the market, and I don't think that's necessarily brought out by just utilization figures, because you have this overhang of these laid up vessels that frankly, it's very hard to see how a lot of them could come back into the market just because of the money that would need to be spent on them. So your actual supply demand balance is much more in sync. I mean, still it's in favor of the buyer, the oil company, but I think if you're feeling the pulse of the oil companies, they're very much aware that that balance of power is beginning to shift. Where the OSV operators are beginning to have a bit more of a power from the fact that there is scarcity coming in the market, and certainly in some sizes. There's also an issue around the aging of the fleet and the age profile. I mean, you know yourself, Greg, there hasn't been a huge amount of new building in this space for quite some time. Now, oil companies, pre-crash in that 2013-14 period, were imposing ages of in their vetting. Let's say no vessels older than 15 years or third special survey, or 12 years, or whatever the number. Different companies, different numbers. And I would say irrespective of actually the quality of the asset, or the upkeep of the asset, or the maintenance of the asset. So what that was doing was effectively discounting elements of the fleet as non-competitive, even though they weren't competitive. So it'd be interesting to see if those characteristics get and those requirements get relaxed, because you're seeing drilling rig rates going up. And when drilling rig rates go up, OSVs support drilling rigs and their E&P activity. And drilling rig rates are going up because their utilization is going up. So the OSV utilization goes up. We've seen that we're forecasting more FPSOs, more demand, more activity. So it's more activity in the market. But there's some new markets emerging, which I think are actually going to change the dynamic. And people in the OSV space, so you get a lot of talk about offshore wind. Now, if we're really honest, I mean, that circle of oil and gas and that circle of offshore wind, they actually don't meet as much as people maybe would like to, because offshore wind's got a lot more of its own specialist vessels. Some of the construction vessels might go across, but the support vessels less so than the OSV fleet was maybe hoping. But I think once you start looking at floating offshore wind, that's when you're going to see traditional oil and gas assets used, because with floating assets, you're talking the same type of structures. You're talking about a semi-submersible, a spar, a TLP, smaller maybe, but a typical offshore commercial floating wind farm, let's say a gigawatt. Now, we're not there yet, but by the end of the decade, we're looking at putting lots of them in. They're in the planning. So a gigawatt wind farm would be the equivalent of a deep water FPSO. Well, we reckon your mooring lines, you've probably got 5 times the quantity in a floating wind project and 12 times the number of anchors to lay. Now, that equals utilization for large anchor handlers. And we're basically looking at above 16,000 horsepower. And that population is actually not that big. So if that population is moving semi-sub rigs, supporting FPSO tows and all this other activity, we're seeing there's actually going to be more competition for that tonnage from the floating wind farms. And it's not just one floating wind farm in one location. For instance, you'll have the west coast of the US, the east coast of the US, you're going to have the North Sea, you're going to have some Atlantic coast in Europe, you're going to have, as I said, North Sea. You're probably maybe a bit later seeing stuff in the Baltics, definitely stuff in off Ulsan, a major build out in South Korea, build out in Japan, emerging Taiwan. We're going to be seeing, so there's going to be a big geographic fragmentation of a fleet that's really been focused on where the oil and gas reservoirs are. Now, that advocating today, go out and sort of spend your money on 15, 16,000 horsepower anchor handlers. We're just saying now it's the time to start thinking about it, planning it, asking yourselves the questions of, well, okay, if we're needing to have these anchor handlers, past 2025, 26, 27, what type of those anchor handlers are going to be needed in the market? Are they going to be the same anchor handlers that were involved sort of 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Or do we have to start thinking about emissions controls? Are we going to have vessels that aren't burning NGO or even MDO? Are we looking at vessels that are hybrids with batteries? Although obviously for anchor handlers, you're not really getting the torque when you're adding a battery system from there. Or do you have to look at alternative fuels, fuel cells? Where do you get the fuels from? These arguments. I mean, we are advocates that we are in an energy transition, and that transition is occurring, and it's mandated by clients and by regulations and international agreements. But it's a transition. It's over time. It's not saying by 2030 everybody's got to go all renewable. But if you're dealing with renewable companies, you have to expect that part of their KPIs is to have minimal emissions. So to be to actually for your vessels, you don't want to be emitting. So we're not saying we don't have the answers. And actually, if you take a straw poll of a lot of owners and operators, they said, well, we don't have the answer. We know we have to do it. We have to test it, and we have to try different technologies. And some people say, well, methanol's a fuel, or ammonia, or hydrogen, or, well, not the internal combustion engines, it's fuel cells, or it is internal combustion engines, or it's batteries. I think it's quite simply there's space for everything. But flexibility is going to be the key. And that's just something we would say as one of the challenges for owners. There are definitely going to be the opportunities there. There's tightness. And just to, finalize one point, I would actually say to people, the soft skills are probably going to become every bit as much of a challenge as steel. What I mean by that is we've had a period of downturn in the industry where people have left the industry. They've been squeezed. The mariners that man these vessels have been squeezed down on their day rates. They've not had the work because the vessels haven't been working as much. So competency has left the segment. Two, that competency, the real competency with things like anchor handling, actually laying deep water anchors, is relatively limited, and it's aging and leaving the fleet. A high percentage of mariners, and whether it be in the bridge or in the engine room, are Ukrainians and Russians, which again at the moment poses challenges, whether mixing crews on vessels, getting Ukrainians back to their home country and out of the country, and all that. And these practical things, when you start adding up, you say, okay, well, we can build a vessel, but where can you get the man hours? And you actually, paper man hours are not good enough, because once you're working for the sorts of companies that are going to be building the floating wind farms, a lot of them will be oil and gas companies, and they have their standards, including the amount of practical hours doing the operation you're going to do in dynamic positioning, in anchor handling, to the level. So it's not an easy fix, but it's one to think about how to maintain, retain the skill set that's there, but then how to attract and develop new skill set that's not just got the paper tickets, because they won't be enough, but they've got the actual man hours and the logbooks to prove that they've got those exercises. And I think we'll find steel is a challenge that can be overcome, possibly easier than that manpower challenge.
Okay, well, Phil, as always, there's as many questions as there are answers. So we truly appreciate you sharing your insights, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Oh, thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed the chat.